Oh, it says stand. Just a joke?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just ask that everyone fill these seats up first? The tables are supposed to be just for overflow. I know it's the end of the day, but we'd appreciate it. I'll bring it through simple fun. No, the ball forward.
I demonstrated what? I did.
She has a bad cold.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last session of the day. This session is Aspirational Masculinity, a positive approach of leadership and excellence. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Don.
How you doing? Can the folks in the back, can y'all come join us a little bit? Yes or no?
Don't be shy. We can go back
So
there.
what you gotta do? It's the last session of the day. Y'all just can't sit back there and like veg out on me. Y'all ain't coming. Right? Because y'all gonna force me to do this, right? And then the camera's gonna get mad at me. So can I just begin by very quickly? My name is Don McPherson, and I am not sure what to call myself, but I've been doing work on gender-based violence prevention for about 30 years. I was a student athlete at Syracuse University, played football there many years ago, had a fairly successful football career, and then I'll fill in the blanks in a moment. But just want to do that really quick introduction. Like I said, I've been doing work around gender-based violence prevention for a number of years, currently doing some work with the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence on this topic of aspirational masculinity. But I want to begin by asking all of you, because we do have a small enough crowd, why you came to this session, or were you told one counterpart goes one way, one goes another way, and you all try to gather together? Is there anything particular about the conversation around masculinity, the question about what is aspirational masculinity? Obviously, we'll get into that. But is there anything in particular that you came to this particular session for? Yes.
I have a 17-year-old son, so I just wanted to give advice.
So it's personal. You have a 17-year-old son. Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Same reason I have a son. He's 4, but he'll be 17.
He'll be 17 eventually. Yes. Right? God willing. So, moms and sons. Anybody else?
Curiosity.
What's the curiosity?
And we try to say, well, I'm asking the question, so always good on advice.
Awesome. Okay. Want to know what I have to say about masculinity? Because you're a masculine person. Anything else? Yes. All the way in the back. See, that's why I said come front.
Interesting. Man, I'm good. I help facilitate a young men group, my site, basically.
So you facilitate young men's group. Awesome. Yes, sir.
I was going to say more or less the same thing. Are there lessons that you're talking about here that can be implemented in everybody's day-to-day work with populace things?
Yep.
Born and raised an SU fan, you're awesome then, and I think you're going to do a great job.
I was prepared for this.
Yeah.
Like if you remember me from football, that just means you're old. Or just means I'm old, right? Because you probably went there on your father's knee. So, cool. Anybody else?
I wanted to see a West Hempstead High School alumni with me.
We went to the same high school. Go Rams. West Hempstead, Strong Island in the house. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
The question is why we
Yes. Why you came to this particular session?
along with my also running this organization, doing social justice, mental health, leadership development for different citizens in Arizona.
Awesome.
And men are the perpetrator of violence in the community who comes from Compton. So,
Say that last thing you said out loud.
men are the perpetrator of violence in our community. It comes as the origin of something that it comes from. If we don't address that, it's going to continue to be a problem.
And you said men are the common denominator.
Yeah, this is common denominator in masculinity, how we're raised and perceived, how we think we need to be, and then under pressure of certain circumstances, we respond to our environment, how we think we're supposed to respond.
Right. So, what's your name?
Raul.
Raul, you nailed it. You nailed a part of what my goal is with all of you. And I'm still going to continue to ask that question if anyone else has a reason why they're here. But you all, and then the other thing I was going to ask, that Raul was just talking about, is the common denominator. So if it's gun violence, if it's drug use, if it's different kinds of interpersonal violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, all the different categories of men's violence against women, the common denominator is male behavior. And we have yet to have an honest conversation, even when it comes down to if you heard, those of you in this room, if you heard there was an active shooter, what would you expect? Who's the perpetrator? Male. Right? And what would we say afterwards? It's guns, and it's mental health. Women have access to guns, and women have mental health problems. Why don't women do it? And we know they don't do it. So we are afraid to have a really honest conversation if we're truly going to do the prevention of that thing. And all of you are trying to do prevention. That's why I was going to ask around the room to just shout out like what different, where do you work? In other words, just not just with youth, but where do you work? In criminal justice? Is it in corrections? Is it probation? Just shout out. Probation?
Probation, youth park.
Probation?
Street outreach.
Street outreach?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement,
ATI,
what's ATI?
alternatives to incarceration.
Alternatives to incarceration. All of you are doing different things that ultimately are dealing with men's violence, or the inability of men to deal with what the current sort of historical understandings of masculinity are. Is that correct? I want to be very, and you're going to hear me talk about this in a little while, of being very deliberate and intentional about how we talk about the issues. Is there anything else that somebody came here to hear in particular? Yes. Right. Yep. So this thing is clicking. I'm gonna try that. Maybe there's something stops. I got it. Yes, thanks. Anybody else? Thank you. So let me give you a little bit of a little bit of my background at the same time, giving you a sort of a trajectory of the work that has been going on for a few decades around masculinity. Let me just ask this question. If you all heard that there was a conversation on masculinity that was going to be had at this symposium, what do you think the conversation was going to be about? About toxicness. Toxic masculinity, right? I ask men all the time, and young men all the time, is there anything good about masculinity? When they think about that term, and they say, no, it's a negative term. It's not a negative term. But we only talk about it in a negative way. I'm going to get into that. And when I said the sort of the state of the field around masculinity in these conversations, and why we have not made progress in that area at all, to be quite honest with you. But let me just give you a quick my background. I'm from Long Island. As I said, I was a student athlete at Syracuse University, played football there in the 80s, and started with then and Governor Cuomo, Mario Cuomo, a program called Athletes Against Drunk Driving. So that was in 1984, so 40 years ago. I started working with traffic safety here in New York State. As I always say, talking to students, too young to drink and too young to drive about drunk driving. So basically talking to them about their parents' behavior. Right? Not having an honest conversation about alcohol, not having a conversation about those behaviors. And as I say all the time, the only reason I was there was because I was a football player. Not because I had any experience, not because I had any understanding. In fact, I always say the only thing I knew about drunk driving at the time was how to do it. And I was being asked by the state of New York, by local law enforcement in certain parts of Western and Central New York, to go in and talk to young people about this critical social issue because the adults have lost the ability to speak honestly. And so the work that I've been doing for 40 years is around issues that come to all your doorsteps, around issues that we've all been afraid to talk about, and we've been raised not to talk about. You don't talk about the drug use in your family, you don't talk about the violence in your family, you don't talk about all other kinds of problems that exist in all of our families, in all of our communities. And we've all been raised not to talk about that. And then it shows up, as I was just talking with someone earlier, about all the things that we experience, all the trauma we experience as kids, and the different experiences. It all comes, what's in the well comes up in the bucket. And so all those things that we have not been raised how to navigate. And in particular, when it comes to boys and masculinity, I'm going to make this point. So I've been in the field of the prevention of sexual and domestic violence, as I say, all forms of men's violence against women for 30 years. The field, and I'm going to say this as a criticism of the field that I have been in for a long time and still work in, has not been interested in our boys getting better. We haven't been interested in our boys getting better. We're not doing that work. We want to stop the violence that impacts women and girls. We have not been interested, and that's why when I asked you about that conversation on masculinity, the masculinity conversation has been about how we stop these things from happening. Knowing that boys and men are the perpetrators in the preponderance of violence committed against women and girls. That's been the goal of the field. And so I came to the field in an almost very accidental way, because I was an athlete being asked to do the work that women and survivors were asking men like myself to do. I have not been doing the work that our boys need. I've been doing the work that women and survivors have asked men like myself to do. I haven't been doing the work that our boys need. And as a result of not being intentional and deliberate about the work that our boys need, boys are struggling in a variety of ways. And one of the most important, in my opinion, books that has been written in the past several years. I published a book in 2019, and it was one that did not exist when I started doing this work, and I wanted a book about me. I was not a perpetrator. I didn't come to this work as a survivor, as a perpetrator. I didn't see violence in my home. I'm going to talk about my dad in a little while. My father was a cop. My mom was a school nurse. Grew up in a really cool family, in a really cool neighborhood. I didn't come to it from that issue, but when I started doing this work, there was nothing in the literature that spoke to me. And yet I still didn't have an understanding of masculinity in a really comprehensive way. So one of the most important books that's been written recently, and I'm not even going to top my book, that published in 2019, was a book called Of Boys and Men by a gentleman named Richard Reeves. It's an important book, and there's some people in the field who don't like it because he has 3 sons, and in many ways he's trying to advocate for his sons, which he is doing. But what's important about his work is that he's a Brookings Institution scholar who was just doing research on a number of different issues. Morbidity, suicide, drug use, education levels, home ownership. Every place he looked, boys were falling behind women and girls. And he was saying, wow, this is a problem. We know this in higher education, for example. In 1971, there was 60% men, 40% women on college campuses. That number is shifting and it's showing no signs of changing. We know that there's a cliff coming in the coming year or two of students enrolled in higher ed. Boys are enrolling in higher ed at a lower rate than ever. So there's a variety of different ways in which Richard Reeves was looking at suicide, drug use, crime, and everywhere he looked, boys and men were struggling. What's important about that is that, as I said a little while ago, we tend to look at the work around masculinity as boys who are criminals, or boys who are incarcerated, or boys who are dealing with mental health issues. It is across the lifespan in a variety of different ways that boys and men struggle. And it is incumbent upon not just the people in this room, because it's not just OPDV and DCJS, and it's got to be all of us. It's got to be part of education. What are we teaching in our schools? How are we engaged? We've done a lot of work. We've been very intentional and deliberate with women and girls. STEM programs. I say this now that, you might hear this, you may have heard this recently, that we're now 50 years out from the time when a woman cannot get a credit card without a man's signature. It's been 50 years. And in that time, I can tell you, because I've been a part of it with the Women's Sports Foundation and Women's Advocacy and Gender Equity and all the work that we've done, Title IX and Women in STEM programs, all the work that we've done, Women in Sports, that we were intentional and deliberate about telling women they could be everything. We didn't tell them what. We just told them they could be everything. And right now, there's a black woman named Jeanette Epps, who was from the city of Syracuse, one of the worst communities for black people in the country. I live there, not there. You know, she was a guy from Syracuse? Okay. You know what I'm talking about. Jeanette Epps, you know where she is right now? Pardon my language, she's in fucking space. She's an astronaut. We didn't raise her to be an astronaut. We raised her to be a whole person. We raised her to be a whole woman. She chose that because she had the confidence to choose that. We are more comfortable with the thought of a black woman from almost being president than we are with a boy being a nurse. We have been deliberate and intentional with our girls that we don't even blink that Jeanette Epps is in space. But if a boy said he wanted to be a nurse, imagine what that's like. That he wanted to seek to help people. Maybe he was like me and had a mother who was a nurse and wanted to be that. And we shamed him. Then what happens to him? So as I said to you, I came to this work accidentally. I was playing football in 1994, retired from 7 years of professional football in the NFL and Canadian Football League. I went to Northeastern University to the Center for the Study of Sport and Society to work with a white man named Richard Lapchick, whose father in 1950, Joe Lapchick, was the first head coach and general manager of the New York Knicks. In 1950, Joe Lapchick signed the first black player in the NBA, a guy named Matt Clifton. It was actually a film released a couple years ago, called Sweetwater. It was the story of Joe Lapchick signing Nat Sweetwater Clifton to a contract in the NBA. And Richard Lapchick, a little boy at the time, watched his dad go through being called a nigger lover, having death threats at the Garden in New York City. And Richard Lapchick dedicated his life to the issue of racism in sports. I wasn't a quarterback, I was a black quarterback. And that was a thing, it's still a thing. And so when I met Richard Lapchick in the spring of 1994, I was in my last year in Canadian Football League. I was ready to give it up. He had just come back from Nelson Mandela's inauguration, personally invited because of his work in the anti-apartheid movement. A few months later, he invited me to come to Northeastern and work at the Center for the Study of Sports Society. And I went there thinking that I was going there to work with this white man who was doing work around racism in sport, because that was my issue. I was 29 years old. I told you I wrote a book. The second chapter of the book is titled 29. I was 29 years old, the first time I heard anyone talk about masculinity or all different forms of men's violence against women. It was a guy named Jackson Katz. He wasn't just talking about domestic violence and sexual assault. As I said to you all before, all the different categories of violence and all the different categories of what you all deal with. He wasn't talking about sexual assault or rape, or sexual harassment, or workplace sexual harassment, all the different ways in which we can segment men's behavior so that nothing gets solved. And so like I said, it was the first time I ever heard it, and I knew about it. I was just confronted actually one of my teammates 41 years ago, who I watched sexually assault somebody. My best friend in high school I was a quarterback, he was my wide receiver. We all know he was abusive to his girlfriend. We said before about all the issues that were raised not to talk about. I saw it, wasn't my issue. I was talking about drunk driving, I was talking about all these other issues. Why wasn't that my issue? And that was the thing that really struck me when I met Jackson Katz, my mentor in this work, and I heard him talking about all forms of men's violence and twins. So a couple things I want to do, a few things I want to do in this conversation. One is for those of you who work with young people, work with young men, is the tool of aspirational masculinity that we need to employ to help our boys who end up in so many other ways in almost every office in this room. The other thing that I want to talk very specifically is to the men in this room who are like me at 29 years old. Wait a minute, I've never talked about this. My dad never talked about this. When did I learn what it meant to be a man? How can I help young men in the programs if I haven't truly examined my own stuff? Because here I was at 29, had been working in schools, working with summer programs in Canada, did all this kind of work on Long Island and Jersey and Connecticut, working in schools, and had not examined my own stuff, had not examined my language, had not examined my attitudes. What was the impact of me not examining that on young people? And then the third thing I want to do is to appeal to all of you in all your different divisions to start using common language. And I'm going to talk about this in a moment, that we have to move from prevention work, that probably is in the title of a lot of your work, a lot of your programs, to promotion. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. When I heard that moment that I heard Jackson Katz, and there's two things two terms that I want to address. One is privilege. Because very often when we talk about privilege, the person who has a privilege that somebody else identifies gets defensive. I didn't even know I had this privilege until you pointed it out. So you might tell me I have male privilege. I'm like, what are you talking about? I didn't know I had that privilege. Didn't know that was working for me. Usually the person who's being accused of having a privilege doesn't know they have it until a person who does not share that privilege points it out. So there's a defensiveness to it. So we say that you need to give up white privilege to make space for me as a person of color, right? And I need to give up my male privilege to make this. There's an argument for that, but it's an argument. This is how I look at privilege. And you know this is one of my greatest privileges. Is, you know how I go to games at the Dome in Syracuse? I just walk in. I don't need a ticket. I don't need credentials. My jersey's hanging in the building. I couldn't give up that privilege if I tried. And by the way, I don't want to give it up. I don't want to stand with the humanity. I don't want to take a piss in that nasty trough of a urinal. You know, like you've been to the Dome, right? It's nasty. I don't want to do that. Right? So when we talk about privilege, it's like, wait a minute. Even when you point it out, I'm like, well, that sounds pretty cool. I don't want to give that up. Here's how I look at privilege. My privilege keeps me from understanding the experience of 40,000 other people in that moment. My privilege keeps me from understanding, if I do have a privilege, how my privilege impacts those 40,000 other people. My privilege keeps me from looking at my own stuff, because I don't have to worry about what everybody else is dealing with. I look at privilege, what does it keep you from learning? And when I was 29 years old, I realized that my privilege kept me as a man from learning about my stuff, my silence, which is the greatest privilege that men have around social issues, is silence. And so at 29, I realized that that was the big, and because of that privilege that we as men have around gender issues, if we said gender equity, if we said gender justice, it's all about women. Women can't have gender equity unless men see ourselves as gender beings. There can be no gender equity if we don't see ourselves as gender beings. We are influenced socially by who we are as men. And so part of what's happened, because over the last 30 years, and I'm going to come back to this term toxic, over the last 30 years, because what women wanted was men, stop that shit. I don't have time to talk to you. I go speak on college campuses all the time. Another 400 college campuses around the country. Just was 2 in the last week. I got an hour. Stop that. And because that's been the ways in which we've talked about masculinity, men are not standing up and saying, hey, let's examine masculinity. Let's examine my privilege. Let's deconstruct masculinity. We haven't done it. We haven't done it. And by the way, I just want to make this one point about where we are. Like, this is not a unique time. The Boy Scouts were created because society was changing. And we want to get boys back to that rugged individualism. YMCA was Young Men's Christian Association, was the wayward boys in the UK. Boys were struggling. If you remember the Promise Keepers from the 80s and the 90s, my brother, who was a pastor and also played in the NFL as a pastor of the church in San Diego, he's a Promise Keeper. It was started by a football coach named Bill McCartney. It was filling football stadiums of men. This was in the 80s and the 90s. Filling football stadiums full of men. There's a book by a feminist scholar named Susan Faludi called Stiffed, The Betrayal of the American Male, written in the 80s. And she detailed very clearly what was happening to men at the time. With jobs leaving, being hired, taking over family farms. Steel industries falling apart in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland. The global economy impacting the local worker. Men were struggling. Men were going to football stadiums to hear from a football coach. We're saying, I'm struggling, I'm hurting, I don't know how to do this. I'm dealing with alcoholism, I'm dealing with loss of jobs. Men were struggling. And the Promise Keepers, I told you my brother was a pastor, the Promise Keepers said, the Bible says you're the rightful man at the head of the house, so go be that man. Didn't give men the tools, just said the Bible says it. It wasn't enough. I told you my brother's a pastor of a mega church in San Diego. I'm a heathen. I don't read my Bible every day. Right, so it doesn't work for me. So what's there for me? And because we're at another period where men are struggling, but men still have privilege and are still silent, we say that masculinity is toxic. I told you before, we're not interested in helping boys be better, we're interested in getting rid of the toxicity. You have a generation of young men now that have only heard masculinity referred to as being toxic. Let me remind you, before we use toxic to talk about relationships or masculinity, we most often use toxic to talk about waste. You separate toxic waste from garbage. Well, you have 2 trash cans back there. You separate toxic waste from garbage. And all our boys are hearing is that their very identity as being male is toxic. Get rid of it. But we haven't said with what. We haven't given them anything to walk towards. We've just been telling them, stop that shit. We haven't given them something to move towards. And this is where we have to move from prevention to promotion. What do we want for them? What do we want them to have in their lives? And the conversation about that, and this is why I arrived at this, that conversation is the same conversation around domestic violence and sexual assault. I want you to have a loving, caring, egalitarian, respectful, vulnerable relationship with whoever you choose. And you know who that starts with? Yourself. How do you see yourself? And so we have to be deliberate and intentional in that conversation. And we have to recognize that we have a generation of boys who've been told that who they are is toxic. And we haven't given them something. So I just want to do a really quick, and I'm gonna leave time for questions, but I'm also gonna say this. If any of you have a question as I go through this, please don't hesitate to raise your hand if something hits you and you just want to shout it out. When I talk about being deliberate and intentional for our boys, and for those of you who work with boys, I know it may sound like, oh, I've got kids who, remember one time I was up in Harlem doing a session, and the guy said, like I said before, you don't have a lot of time. I only got a little bit of time with this guy. He said, you got 15 minutes with the kid on the corner. You know, how are you going to influence him? How are you going to have this conversation about masculinity? There's a program, the program that I got involved with was introduced bystander to sexual violence prevention work. And there was another program called Green Dot that showed up on college campuses. And instead of saying, I came from the work, as I said, with men having this conversation about bystander, how do men talk to each other? And this woman named Dorothy Evans said, well, if a guy's about to sexually assault somebody, he doesn't need a lecture on masculinity. True, if that shit's going down, you're not sitting there having a conversation about the complexities of their behavior, the history of patriarchy and misogyny, right? Absolutely. So what do we do? How do we look at that work? If you only have a short amount of time. I always say, if I have 5 minutes with a boy, I'm spending that 5 minutes trying to get a lunch date. I'm not trying to fix him. It's not gonna happen in 5 minutes. You got to first let him know he's loved. First let him know that he's cared about. First let him know that what he's capable of is excellence. What he's capable of is excellence. We have to move from prevention to promotion. You're gonna hear me say this later on, because doing that helps us all to have common language if we're trying to promote the same thing. But the prevention language and scare tactics that we use, the drug programs, everything that I've been doing for over the years, doesn't work, it's never worked. Promotion works. If you want our boys to be excellent, not to show up in any of your agencies, we have to train them and teach them and raise them to be excellent. We don't teach in the classroom to not fail. We don't teach in the classroom to pass by 66. We teach excellence in the discipline. So there's innovation, there's growth. There's a kid cracking a book because he's curious. Because maybe the teacher didn't get to that part yet, but I'm really curious about what you said. Excellence. You don't coach in sports to not lose. You don't coach in sports to win by a point. You coach excellence. There was not one coach that made me run faster, gave me the ability to do the things I did that landed me in the NFL. And what those coaches did, they taught me to love the game. They taught me to love myself as an athlete, that I wanted to be excellent. And I know sometimes that word scares people sometimes. Well, not everyone's going to be excellent. You can be the most excellent version of yourself that you can be. And we have to teach that with our boys. And so I talk about excellence in that way, and I'm going to keep taking my notes because I want to make sure that I get to what those 3 things I said, because this is not working with people from different agencies. Again, trying to have that common conversation that I want to close with. And when I talk about being excellent, I talked about Jeanette Epps earlier, and I talk about being deliberate and intentional. We can't allow, and this is part of the silence of masculinity, men still have power, even though we haven't been intentional about ourselves. We can't allow the ways in which masculinity has been learned to continue. And it's going to be incumbent upon the men, in particular in this room, to get out of our comfort zone and being deliberate and intentional. My father was, I have a daughter who's my mini-me. Y'all have a child who's your mini-you, right? And sometimes you go, oh shit. Right? But I was my father's mini-me. I have 4 siblings, and my parents have been passed for several years. I texted them about a year ago. I told them, I said, and it was several texts. Look, I said, I just want to let y'all know Mom said this, and enough time has passed since she died. I want y'all to know. Another text, it's a really sensitive subject. I want y'all to know that Mom told me this. I can finally tell y'all. I said this, and I want to know that, and I kept dragging it out, just to make sure I had everybody's attention. And the last one was, she wanted y'all to know that I was her favorite. She's dead. She can't argue that point, right? That's it. Argument's over. And there's so many things before he died, I was not grief-stricken. Because I knew the man really well. And I didn't know him really well. I didn't know him as well as I knew him until about a year ago. I did work with the police department in Syracuse. And it was through talking to those officers that I learned some stuff about my father. And I understood him a little differently. Because the man never talked. He was the epitome of stomach. The first version of the book that I wrote, I didn't talk about him. Someone said, wow, you wrote a book about masculinity and raising boys, and you didn't talk about your father at all. Shit, I wonder if Freud is just taking calls. Man, that's like deep. So I had to call him. I had to interview him. I had to ask him about the first time he had sex. I had to ask him about all these things that I was raised not to talk about. It was my father told me, we were having a conversation on the phone, and he was looking out in Florida, and I was telling him about watching X, Malcolm X. I said, Pop, my favorite part of the movie was at the end when it wasn't Denzel Washington. It was Malcolm X. There was real footage of him. He was smiling and laughing. Never saw Malcolm X smile. The vision that we all had as black men of Malcolm X was the AK-47 sitting by the window. Was the menacing Malcolm X with his fist in the air and a menacing face on his wall. And all of a sudden, he was this man, this beautiful man. I said it to my father. You know what my father said? Oh, he had a warm personality. He was really engaged. What are you talking about? My father knew Malcolm X. He guarded Malcolm X. Never told me. Never talked about it. My father knocked on John Gotti's door. My father was in internal affairs in the 70s in New York City. There's movies written about that shit. My father was there. Never once did he talk about it. I didn't know my father did for a living until I was out of high school. Well, in high school. And those of us and those of you who deal with a lot of stuff, if we're going to teach our boys to be authentic, we're going to teach our boys to be whole, we as adult men need to evolve. We as adult men need to demonstrate that. My father's stoicism, my father's silence, made the voice of other men, like the asshole football coaches that I had as a kid, made their voices more powerful. While my father was silent, the good man that he was, and he was a good man, he was a great man, the good man that he was, his silence about his wholeness, what he cared about, what he felt. I found out my father used to not just hide his emotions. He used to, I remember as a kid, you know, family watching TV. Y'all remember back in the day, there was only like 3 stations on, so you all watch the same thing, right? Whole family sat there and watched the same program. I remember my father leaving the room, but I found out later on why he left the room sometimes. He was crying. The commercial about a mom and a dad and a boy or something like that, he would be crying. He didn't just hide his emotions, he hid with them. And he never talked about it. I got mad at him. I played in a game once and was knocked unconscious. My other brother was a boxer, and my brother and my father were in the stands. And they used to watch fight films together, different boxers. And there was one fight where this guy got knocked out and he was unconscious, but his leg was twitching. And we thought it was funny. Like, dude was knocked out, he's so bad knocked out, he's trying to run away, right? And we laughed about it. I got knocked out in the game, you know, I'm laying there unconscious. I wake up, and like the defense is on the field. Like, how does the defense on the field? Like, well, it was 4th down, and we didn't make it. But there I was, right? They went to commercial, came back from commercial, I was still sleeping. When I came to, my first thought was my parents. So I did this. To signal my brother and my father I was cool, right? My whole life, that was probably 1985, 86. My father died, 10 years ago, so you do the math, because I stink at that. And right before my mother died, I was telling that story to my mother and my children. And my mother looked at face. If you've had a parent who's passed, right before they die, they start confessing shit. Right? Trying to clear their conscience of different things. And I saw the look on her face like she's got something to share. And she said, yeah, your father never saw that. He was crying, pacing the concourse of the stadium, the dome. And I got mad at him. Not because he didn't teach me that, I got mad at him that he didn't show me his wholeness. He didn't show me his humanity. His son was unconscious. What did he do? He made it a joke. You know how that has impacted my life and my inability to talk about I'm hurting, to talk about I'm scared, to ask for help, to just suck it up, to not say I'm whole, I feel, I care, I'm vulnerable. I'm mad at him for that. I'm mad at him for that. That's the part that I say to the men in this room. Is, like I said, for those of you who work with young people, we need to be deliberate and intentional in that. And for the older men in this room, I talk about I want for boys. I want for them. I want them to be authentic. Because here's what happens. If they're being inauthentic and trying to man up and suck it up, that's when they get in fights. That's when they get in trouble. That's when they're trying to fit in. And they start doing all these inauthentic things. Because they're trying to fit into this understanding, as Raul said about masculinity. So they're trying to man up. And they're trying to fit in. And the way that we teach them that as adult men is to live authentic, to live whole, and to live what I call evolving lives. And I'm going to come back to the evolving for a second, but I wanted to speak to the authentic and the whole for our boys. And those of you who work with boys, when I learned this stuff from Jackson Katz, I learned about masculinity. I started thinking about, when did I learn what it meant to be a man? It wasn't from my father. It was from the other men in my life where I heard saying, that's what being a man, man up, suck it up. So when I asked the men in this room, to the men in this room, when you were a little boy, what was the worst insult you could hear as a little boy? Punk, even worse than that, but punk is a part of it.
Acting like a girl.
Acting like a girl. Stop anything like a girl, right, men? So two things, and when I say really innocent, even before the language gets a little worse, very innocent. Two things about that, and I'm not going to go deep into the more significant one, although the more significant one, as I said to y'all, the work that I've been doing for the last 30 years, is that the first thing that boy hears is to man up. But the second thing is he learns that women and girls are less than. You call a guy that's my dog, he's a cool cat, he's like a truck, he's got pipes. You refer to a guy as an inanimate object or an animal to compliment. But you compare us to a sister, and it's the ultimate insult. That's misogyny. Call me all the other things, don't call me that. Put a pin in that for a second. If I said out of that boys learn in that implied way what it means to be a man, right? And I said, what does it mean? And I'm going to ask them in this room. If I had a board here, just imagine a blackboard here, and I said, what does it mean to be a man? Men, what would you answer me? What are we supposed to be? Shout it out. Tough, strong. What else? Provider. In charge. What else? Protector. Leader. Brave. Provider. That's provided twice. We got a lot of shit to take care of. Sometimes it's just the jokes are for me. Right there, be protected. Anything else, man?
Don't ask for help.
Ooh, whoa. Who said that? So, I've been asking that question for about 30 years. Of myself, men around me, and in settings like this. PhDs, every race, every ethnicity, every demographic, with incarcerated men, with PhDs, with middle school boys in Brooklyn in a summer program just a few months ago, PhDs on the college campus just a couple weeks ago. White, black, every demographic of men, young and old, men in the field, helpers, helping men, MSWs, every single group of men, road construction, white men in rural Wisconsin, every single group of men give me the same answer, the same exact answer for the last 30 years. Be tough, be strong, be a protector, be a provider. It's safe. I would argue it's cowardice. And the second question I would ask the men in this room is, does that define you? define you? Does it? This is not rhetorical. Does it define you? So here's the question. What's missing? That defines you. I'm asking the men in the room. This is not a rhetorical question. And y'all, I asked y'all at the very beginning of this, why you came to this. So now I'm going to throw it at you. Why are you here? Because if you're here as a passive participant, you're part of why our kids, boys are struggling. What is missing from that description of who you are, bro?
The space to be the other person.
Tell me what that is. I need you to be deliberate and intentional. I need you to be specific. What is missing?
The space to be vulnerable, to be real, to be wounded, to not know, to be lost, to be insecure, to be fragile, to be...
Okay, so now, wait, give me some positive things, because you're a smart man. You came here and said something really fucking brilliant, right? So I want you to hear you. What does that mean to you? Not just the space to not do those things, but tell me the beauty of you.
Genuine, powerful, balanced, grounded, aligned.
Men, sweet, thoughtful, emotion, considerate, respectful. If I had that list on the board, the list of what you truly are is bigger than the list that the narrative that we've been telling our boys. And I always put up, and Kelly Owens from WDV she always wants to know after me, she goes, "You okay now?" Because I put up lonely, scared, insecure. I'm divorced. I have 2 daughters, both in college. One's my mini-me, the other one's still mad at me about the divorce. I live in Syracuse. I had to move to Syracuse because it was cheaper to live on Long Island, where I got my ass kicked financially because of divorce and COVID. I'm scared. I'm lonely. I'm not, and Kelly would say, "Don, are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm okay." You know what else I am? I'm in the demographic of the highest rate. This goes back to Richard Reed's work. I'm in the demographic of the highest rate of suicide. Of men who cannot evolve, cannot grow, cannot say I need help. And I'm going to come back to that in a brief second, but I want to talk about boys for a second. What we give our boys is those qualities you're saying. I always ask boys, if a boy stops being one of those things, the first group, the first list of things you gave me, he starts being loving and caring and sensitive and says he needs help, starts acting like his mother, what kind of language does he call? And I always ask, and one of those words is bitch, right? Bitch means the female equivalent of the word nigger, so the word that's put on people to keep them in a place. But in order for it to work against women, it has to work on boys first. That's why we feel like a girl is damaging to boys before it becomes women's problem. And I would ask boys, if it isn't worse, if another boy calls you a little bitch, that's even worse. And that's right, you little bitch. That just, we're gonna hang out later, you know? And then as boys, if somebody calls you a little bitch, what's gonna happen? It's gonna be a fight. So we used to have law enforcement come and talk to our football team when I was in school before every year. They say, listen, when someone gets into a fight, you go one of 2 places. You go to jail or you go to the hospital. Neither one of them are good. And you have boys now fighting, getting in fights, or doing other kinds of illegal things, or taking risks that they shouldn't be taking, to defend something that does not even fully define them. Because we tell boys that manhood is something that you get to when you're done. You're finished. And so they end up defending their manhood. You don't punk me. They end up defending something that does not even define them, not even close. That's why I ask you all, what is your wholeness? We have to show them their wholeness. We have to validate their wholeness. We have to allow them to live in their wholeness. That means that we as adult men need to be deliberate and intentional in the programs that we run with them, so that they see us as whole, they see that model that they can aspire to. And it helps us understand men who are dealing with years and years and years of ignoring their identity, ignoring who they are. And that piece about not evolving. I said that I'm in the highest demographic of suicide. It's one of those. When I wrote the book, several years ago, I had a list of 33 guys that I knew that I played football with in college or in the NFL. Didn't include Canada, just college and the NFL. It's 33 guys on the list. Next to each one name was an RB, DB, LB, different positions, football positions. Next to each name was a W or B, white or black guy. A C or P, college or pro. 6 S's circled. 6 suicides. One of those suicides was a guy named Chris Gedney from Syracuse. High school American, college All-American, right there in Syracuse. Liverpool High School, then Syracuse University. Played in the NFL. Good-looking, cisgender, heterosexual white guy. 6'5", beautiful face, charming personality. Everyone loved Chris Gedney. Came back, worked for the university, was working in athletics, fundraising, table of 10 in best restaurants in New York City, where we were fundraising with donors and alumni. He asked Chris how he's doing, living the dream, Donnie, living the dream. It'll be, I think, 7 years now in March, that Chris put a shotgun to his head and killed himself. And right away, everyone wanted to blame CTE. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, degenerative brain disease that comes from multiple concussions, that we like to talk about as the excuse for why those men committed suicide. I don't believe in it. I believe CTE exists, don't get me wrong, but if concussions in football or any sport, if concussions lead to that and then death or something else, I shouldn't be standing here. I will put my concussion count up against, maybe not this room, because y'all got some fucked up dudes in this room, so. Right? I mean, I think y'all in law enforcement do some things, right? So, but I would put my concussion count up against many rooms. I told you about the worst one I had. I published a book a few years ago. My brother played in the NFL for 5 years. He's the pastor of a mega church. Why didn't CTE kill us? And those guys who committed suicide, I can tell you because I know them, knew them. One of them was a guy named Junior Seau. If you know football, he was this amazing football player. Big, ferocious guy, kinetic personality, big, friendly guy, called everybody buddy. Hey buddy, everybody say San Diego do Junior Seau. I was talking to student athletes at a college a couple years ago, several years ago, after Junior killed himself, about 2 years after he killed himself. And this young man comes up to me, beautiful young man, standing in front of me. He said, oh, your brother was my pastor. I said, oh, you're from San Diego. He said, yeah, I'm Junior Seau's son. And I said, hey man, I'm sorry. He said, you know what? And I was doing this talk, I didn't talk about Junior. Thank goodness. He said, I didn't know half the things my father was going through until I saw it on ESPN after he killed himself. I don't believe that CTE is the reason that it happens. If we as men can't say, I feel, I care, I'm struggling, I'm hurting, I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to do this alone. I need help. If we don't model that in our everyday lives, our boys don't stand a chance. Because they will not see how to do it. They will not see what excellence looks like. And that is the thing that we can promote. That's why I talk about aspirational. What do I want for you? That's the thing that we can promote, and that's the thing that enables us. If you're just doing prevention work, then gun violence prevention looks like this. Domestic violence prevention looks like this. Alcohol and substance abuse prevention looks like this. And you're all working on the same problem. And you're not working together. But if you start saying, we need our boys to be healthy, we need our boys to be excellent, we need our boys to be nurses and be like Jeanette Epps, to recognize in their wholeness, they can be loving, caring, sensitive, passive, submissive, empathetic, and those are not feminine qualities, those are human qualities and are tools that help them navigate life. And they don't have them. We haven't given them to them. And you all should be demanding, and I say this as someone who's worked in higher education, we should be demanding that secondary education send us better boys. We need workplace sexual harassment in New York City. It's the law. You know why? Because higher education has failed. You had that boy on campus for 4 years and he's still a jackass when he comes to work? Seriously. Because you know what we were doing in college? Take back the night. Re-traumatizing women and thinking that's the solution to men's behavior. walk a mile in their shoes. Because we think that's the solution to men's behavior. We have not been intentional and deliberate with our boys. We have not been promoting what all of you can do together. Because by doing positive promotion, then you can come to common language across all the divisions. Then your work is being supported by other divisions. Then you can have common conversations. Then you can create kitchen table conversations. I was working with an agency in Maryland. We were doing trauma-informed classroom work with the middle schools. I was working with the 2 and 4 year higher ed institutions. And I was doing some workplace sexual harassment with the executive director and a couple of local companies. And we were trying to do the same thing. In the company that we're talking to, we're actually talking to the parents of the kids in the middle school. And we're using different language to have a different conversation. And we're not helping that parent be a better parent. And I'm not going to close with this, but I want to share this one last quick thing. Just a quick question, because I have to do this, and just I can't get away from not doing this, because this to me is the greatest, one of the greatest, if not the greatest public health crisis of this generation of young people. I'm going to ask the adults, and every one of you, this is not just for the men, how many of you from the people who raised you, taught you, please and thank you, yes ma'am, no sir? How many of you from those people did you get a graphic, honest, and sustained conversation about your bodies, sexual behavior, intimacy? Raise your hand. Okay, if you didn't, I didn't know what's going to raise your hand. Don't talk to me. And so I've been asking that question for 30 years. Hasn't changed. And then I ask young men, in particular, if you didn't get it from your parents, where'd you get it from? Remember I said before, my father's silence validated that football coach who told me to suck it up. My father's silence validated other sources of information. My father was the greatest man I've ever known, whose silence validated all those other bad messages. And our silence as adults, because I know the political side of this, I know the board of ed side of this, and all the sides, all the excuses of inaction. And our silence as an adult world, our boys are learning about sex by watching rape. Graphic, honest, and in our silence, that's real. I talked to a group of college men a couple weeks ago, and I said, you can set up. No one's ever taught you about it, and this is what you're watching, this is how you learn it. And they try to make excuses for us. Okay, if the porn that you're watching is so cool, put your mom in it. Is it cool? No. It's not. And in our silence, once again, in our silence, in our privileged silence as adult men, we're not providing our boys with the tools they need to navigate relationships in an honest, caring, loving, whole way. And so this paradigm shift of the work that I'm doing with OPDD is around aspirational masculinity and creating a conversation throughout the social ecosystem, schools, higher education, K-12 schools, higher education, workplace, we're doing workplace sexual harassment, community organizations. How do we create common language in all those places in the ecosystem so that we're supportive of each other at a time when our boys desperately need everything Robert was talking about earlier. Desperately need us to step up and give them something they can walk towards. Give them something that allows them to live their authentic selves. I know I might be sounding, I don't even know how, to be honest with you. I was at a meeting recently, and I was talking like this, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and she was in the field that doesn't think that men can evolve. The field that thinks that men can't do this, or don't want to do this. She goes, I'm sure this is not landing well with a lot of people in the room. And I was being respectful because, as I said before, the men in this field, we're doing the work that women asked us to do. And in very often cases, and I learned this early on, I was more accountable to the women who were not in the room than to the men who were. And I looked at them in the eye and I said, I don't care if the people in this room don't hear me, because they're stuck in this old paradigm. Our boys need us to break that. They need us to start saying, what is our wholeness? We need to demonstrate it so that they can model it. So I know I'm up on time, and I'm going to pause and see if there's any question or comment or tomato to be thrown, or all of them.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
that conversation?
How you started?
Yes. How do you actually break that barrier? How do you? Because I'm keeping on the eye.
Yeah.
I'm listening to what you're saying, and it's resonating real good. Like, and I had a situation when I came home, and I just did 10 years.
Yep.
So I was broken, and I asked for help from my family, and they said, "You strong," and I wasn't.
Yeah.
And I was like, "That I'm not. What y'all telling me right now, I don't need that."
Right.
I'm asking my family where it's supposed to be support at to help me, and they didn't know how because we're viewed as strong.
Right.
And I couldn't be emotional. I didn't know how because I wasn't taught that, as you said.
Yep.
So it's like, how do you have that conversation? How do you break that barrier with these young boys? That it's okay to be vulnerable. I don't know you if you don't let me in.
That's right. First of all, you're doing it right now. You're doing it right now. So, however, your first question, you said how you started, my first thought was, like we, as young men, we're supposed to talk to girls, right? We're supposed to know how to talk to girls, but we don't know what we're doing, right? So what do? You just do it, right? You just start making shit up. You start like whatever might land, right? You start riffing. You start, and if that doesn't work with one, then you go to the next one. Hey, let me try this, and this is right. So you keep trying. And so I'm saying to you, if you run up against that, and I will tell you, I've had this in my whole life, exactly what you're saying. When I first started learning about this, and then I went to friends of mine that I grew up with, I'm like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? So I had to go someplace else. Right? I had to keep knocking on doors until I found one and said, I feel you, I hear you. Right? To the point where just last night, I was with one of my old teammates, and then last night, we talk about this stuff all the time, every day almost. So you gotta keep working at it. Because as you recognize, we're not doing it. Right? Even in this room, you know, we're really walking doing it. So keep doing what you're doing. Work with the people who are doing what you're talking about doing. That's why you're in this room. And demand that it happens. I had some high school, some college students the other day saying, well, what happens if people don't want to do our program? And I said, keep fucking knocking the door down. Don't stop. Don't stop until you demand what you need. And we do it in other ways. We do it for other things that we want in our lives. So keep on doing it. And know right now that you're in a room with people who hurt you. Because you spoke up, people hurt you. You didn't sit here dormant the way that did a little while ago. Right? So I appreciate you for doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Was there another question? I'm sorry.
that person the help and assistance that they need. So when you work with the young man, you also have to work with the family as well, because you can, if that man is trying to change himself, but he's going back to the same so-called toxic environment that he's trying to get away from, it's just going to be.
It just perpetuates itself. Yes.
So you got to work with the whole family.
And that's what he's just talking about, breaking that cycle and getting out of that. And here's the hardest part for a lot of us of looking at your family and saying, man, y'all look kind of messed up, right? And this is this is like I deal with this with my own family because of the things that I believe in and the ways in which I've evolved. I got to challenge my own family on this. I challenge my father on this. So what he just expressed is so important that we recognize, and this is the thing that so many people who I work with in this field, I had a woman say, Don, I keep trying to work with men, they're not going to change. You know what the reality is? Men want to change. Boys want this. They're desperate for it. They're tired of living in this narrowness of who they're supposed to be. That narrowness that we haven't given them the latitude to live in, to be their authentic selves. Because they're boys. Right? I'm talking about little boys. I'm not talking about adult men or even young adolescents. I'm talking about little boys. They start getting that. I'll never forget, being in the airport was a story that I wrote about in my book, and I was going to dedicate the book to this little boy initially because he was in the airport and it was before 9/11, and the boy was just bouncing around, and his mother said, "Will you be a man?" And it shut him down. She didn't say stop. She didn't say I want to hear it. She didn't say you know it. She said be a man, and he knew to shut down. That's scary. What's he do with that? And he knew that. And so we have to even confront our families and the things that we've learned that are ingrained in our culture and our community. Any other questions? Because I know I want to be respectful of everyone's day. My name, yes, okay.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming and presenting this option. I think, you know, when you and I talked a little bit about this presentation, the fact that there's been so much toxic and negativity and presenting an option of promotion and aspirational is what's going to lead us forward. So I really appreciate you coming and providing that resource and that thought and that approach to the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just know that I'm doing work with OPDB and we'll continue to work with OPDB, and I'm going to be beating on the doors of all the different agencies to try to get us to that common language that is positive, that is aspirational. And so my name is Don McPherson. I don't have a card, and who's asked me a little while ago to find a card, but I'm really easy to find. If someone says I had trouble finding you, you really didn't try. And so don't hesitate to reach out if you have a question, you have a follow up. Or anything, or you're back in Syracuse, you say, hey, brother, what's going on, right? Please don't hesitate to reach out because this is what we do. Thank you all very much.